excellent autumn weather, among other things. I've heard different people say they were happy today, so that's good. And the weather certainly adds to it. But I know that before too long, I guess I'm a pessimist. I know before too long it'll be cold and I'll be shoveling snow, but I'll worry about that later. You know, our country has just come through a very, I guess you'd say, diverse and contentious presidential election. It seems that half the country is celebrating and half is angry or sad, and with angry demonstrations, all kind of talks. Even some families are, you know, divided over it. And it kind of popped in my mind a little song. I think it was in the 60s. It says, "What the world needs now is love, sweet love." And I think also it said that's just a thing that there's just too little of. And that's always the case. There's just too little of it. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. Love, the way of God, or the very essence of God, really. It also occurred to me sometimes when we're praying, maybe we don't think, we have trouble thinking, well, what should I pray for? To me, that's kind of always a staple. Pray for more love. Pray for more understanding of what true love is. So let's turn to 1 John chapter 4. First John 4, I'll find that in a minute. Okay. Verse 7. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. So we see that love is a gift of God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. And we're so fortunate that God is a loving, forgiving, slow to anger, quick to forgive. We'd be in big trouble otherwise, more trouble than we already are. In my Bible, it's just across the page, 1 John 5, chapter 5, verse 1. 1 John 5, 1. It says, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. This is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commandments. This is love for God, to obey his commands. So sometimes there's a little confusion about what love is, you know. Is it romance or what? But we'll see more about what true love is and how important it is. Let's turn back now to 1 Corinthians 13. I think that's the love chapter. Okay. 1 Corinthians 13, 1 through 7. And here's Paul speaking. He says, if I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. So that's, you see again, love is a very important ingredient that we need to have in our lives, and more of it. Verse 4. Here it lists some of the attributes of love. And when I heard somebody say, if you just, where it says love here, love is patient, if you just put your name in there and see how that fits you, it's a good exercise. I really think most people in this room know it would fit pretty good. I'm not saying perfect. And we get to some of them where it says always, that kind of, you might wonder a little bit. But love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. and it does not boast, and it is not proud. So if you, a very proud and arrogant person, you begin to wonder how much love they might have. It's not rude. It's not self-seeking. And is not easily angered, and keeps no record of wrongs. That one's kind of hard to learn sometimes. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease, and where there are tongues, they will be stilled. So love never fails. It works every time it's tried, I guess. If you try it in perseverance long enough, and you have to persevere. But I have seen, and I expect all of us have seen times where love has prevailed, But sometimes it takes quite a while. But I think it was like a short circuit, really, to anger and hatred. If a person is angry with you, and you just don't have anything of it, you don't return that anger, you don't return the bad feelings or the insults. Over time, it will quench that. But if you take the other path and you hit back just as hard and just as mean, well, it's like adding fuel to the fire. It's going to get bigger. Let's turn back again to Matthew 22. I should have had these marked where I could find them better. Matthew 22, 37 and 40. And here Jesus is asked by the Pharisees what the greatest commandment is. They were sort of testing Jesus. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." And verse 40, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So that's essentially saying that the Bible, that's all the Bible had in those days, the law and the prophets. It was the Old Testament. That was the Scripture. And it all hangs on those two commandments. And both of them are love. Love and obey God, and love and respect your fellow man. And it seems like I'm going backwards on all these. We'll go back again to Matthew 5. But that's just the way it happened. Matthew 5, 43 and 47. Oh yeah, we get to the more difficult part of love. It says, you have heard, verse 43 in Matthew 5. So you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on evil as well as the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you only greet your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that? So that is pretty hard to do, but we must endeavor to do that and remember that all people are children of God and may someday be right in the kingdom with us. Let's turn to Romans 13. Romans 13, verse 8 says, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. There again, the law is love. the commandments, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and whatever other commandments there may be are summed up in this one rule. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. And, we think these things are hard to do, and they are. Loving God, we all want to love God. Many people say they love God. I think some people even say they love God that don't know God, and that's probably pretty hard to do. But we've got the book, and it tells us everything we need to know. And in closing, let's turn to Isaiah 11. I really kind of like this scripture. Pretty good. Many others too, but I like Isaiah 11. And probably most of you know what it says before we get there, but I'll eventually get there. Isaiah 11, 9 and 10. And here it's talking about the kingdom and how it will be in God's kingdom. And it talks about the infant that can play on the hole of the cobra, and the young child can put their hand in the viper's nest, and the wolf and the lamb will lie down together, all that. In verse 9 it says, they will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. For the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And of course, that will only happen by God's outpouring of Spirit. And then loving will not be hard. It'll be easy.
This message today is angry false prophets, peace and prosperity. Angry false prophets, peace and prosperity. You remember we speculated a number of times that the media performs some of the functions of a false prophet. In this country, it's about 27% of Americans go to church on a somewhat regular basis. It seemed their voting went that way too. Those who went to church more than once a month were I think 85% more likely to vote for the conservative candidate. Those who do not go to church at all was 80-some% to vote for the progressive candidate. So there's something to be said there. But since most Americans don't go to church regularly, we have to assume they get much of their information, moral beliefs, right and wrong, from the media. Obviously, election results stunned the media. They couldn't believe it as the night went on. So I'm going to go to Deuteronomy 5 as we kind of build the case. But all of this, I think we'll see a certain pattern here. Deuteronomy 5:5. This is, of course, Moses' warning about false prophets in general. I stood between the Lord and you at the time to declare to you the word of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the... I must have gotten the wrong verse. Shucks. Hold on. I think I meant to say 13. It's... how these things happen? Okay. 13:5. But the prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death because he's spoken in order to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to redeem you from the house of bondage, to entice you from the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. So he shall put away evil from you. And I would say the media in general wants to turn people away from the God of the Bible. I'm sure they'd all agree with that too. If your brother, the son of your mother, the son of your daughter, the wife of your bosom, your friend, who is your own soul, secretly entices you, saying, let us go and serve other gods which you've not known, neither you nor your fathers, the gods of the people which are all around you. I would say the media is telling us, don't look at all this traditional Bible Christian stuff. Go with the global community. See what the rest of the world is doing. I mean, that, in general, that's what the media says. Around you, near to you, and far off. The rest of the world, outside of the country. And from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth. And basically the media, they're globalist, and a lot of this global warming is really a way of earth worship. We're worshiping trees and animals over people. So I'd say the media has been pulling us away from the true God, away from traditional Judeo-Christian values, away from biblical values. That's one of the things the media does. And to that extent, they're playing the same role or part of the role of the false prophet. And I think some leftist churches are kind of fit into that too. Well, they're angry because they tried to more or less put on the hard press to, as one said, if they could have just gotten a progressive candidate elected, they could really lock things up. If they could get control of Congress, they could take control of the Supreme Court. Some of the older justices probably would have retired, and they could pack them with really progressive judges who'd be around for the next 30 years, and they'd have it locked up for good. But something went wrong. In spite of the power of the media, and I remember them, they would take a poll, and because I could tell when they're trying to use polls to manipulate public opinion. They would say, polls from one of the most important battleground states has a progressive candidate up by 12. The other guy has no chance. It's all over. And when a poll didn't show that, they were silent. And, you know, most of you know what I mean. But it didn't work that way. The voters just didn't buy it. The media had a lot of power, but they're angry because they weren't able to muscle their candidate through. They've lost all three branches, and 2/3 of the state legislatures have all gone to the more conservative party. It's not all good news because one man looked underneath all the issues and he said, as far as key moral issues, the public is still not that moral. Marijuana and some other things did well. So it's not a moral victory, but it's more of a political victory. But we're still happy. But the media is angry. They're mad. And they're really mad. And so let's look at what happens when the media is mad. I'm going to go to 1 Kings 19. But we'll give you the background of the story, which most of us know well. Elijah had called the people of Israel and told the king, you want rain again? You bring all the prophets of Baal to Mount Carmel, and we'll see, you know, who is the real God, Baal or the English version, Jehovah. And of course, you know the results of that. It went very badly for the false prophets. Jezebel kept her set of false prophets out of it. I wonder if she kind of knew, but I guess we really don't know. But she was a queen of the false prophets. I want to read 1 Kings 19, 1 and 3. After that happened, and it was quite clear from the results who was the true God. Let's see, Jezebel, as leader of the false prophets, what was her position? And Ahab told Jezebel and all that Elijah had done, and how he had executed all the false prophets. Then Jezebel sent a message to Elijah saying, so let the gods do to me and more, if I do not make your life as one of them by tomorrow about this time. In other words, she was mad. And she said, I'm going to get you. They say that on Twitter, there are thousands of Twitter requests for the assassination of Trump. I'm just telling what I heard on the radio. It's, you know, it's really, they're ugly, they're angry. And what we have in the streets now are mobs. Now, I'm going to be honest about the mobs. Some of the mobs are probably natural. There are a lot of, how to say this nice, there are a lot of people, especially in the inner cities, but other places, who are people who lack character. If they don't get what they want, they're ready to riot, burn, loot. I mean, they just don't have any character. They're bad news people, you know. And if a little encouragement from the media. I remember when I was in St. Louis at Natalie's uncle's house right before Ferguson, and we're watching all the news shows in St. Louis. He was flipping around. I was just kind of listening. And the media was saying to the mobs out there, if you don't get this guy indicted, burn, burn. I'm thinking, this is the craziest thing. The media in St. Louis was encouraging him. If you don't get what you want, regardless of how the facts come out, burn the town down. I mean, if you were in St. Louis, you'd have seen what I mean. And some of the national media, too. Even some of the mobs writing now talking about Michael Brown, even though the evidence clearly shows, you know, that he was guilty of trying to take the policeman's gun. And all three, even two done by people on his side, proved, you know, that he was in the wrong. But truth doesn't matter. A lot of people who, if you get them mad, and it's easy to get them mad, they're ready to burn, loot, and riot. But I think there's also something additional, besides the bad people who love to riot and loot. There's also professional anarchists. Some of the emails have proven, I think it's George Soros's money, but it may be other people's money as well. They're paying people to cause trouble at certain rallies. They're paying anarchists to go to cities and riot. It's almost as if the false prophets have said, okay, we can't have our way, we'll turn the mobs loose, and some of them are being paid. I mean, paid anarchists. A lot of young people don't have any jobs, you know. And it's like the media has two faces. Let's go to Psalms 55, and I'll show you what I mean by two faces. 55:21, Psalms 55:21. And in 55:21, now some of this has to do with people betraying David, but also you can apply it to the Messiah. But there's a principle here too. 55:21. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were like drawn swords. I believe some of the liberals, some of the media, they've said nice things like give the man a chance to rule and other nice stuff. Some of them, others are just way out there. But they've also, behind the scenes, called on the mobs. You don't hear them telling the mobs, hey, we had a fair election. There's no reason, you know, there's no reason to complain. That's what the people voted for. It's not like there's any evidence the election was stolen. But it doesn't matter. They're not going to say that. It's like they say one thing at one level, but at other levels they've called out the mobs to show their anger. I believe that the prayers of many Americans were answered. We mentioned, I think a few weeks ago, that a lot of the Christian stations were asking people to pray about the election, and I believe God answered the prayers, and we got the best of the two candidates for the circumstances. We have a candidate who's not going to restrict Christianity like the other one said they would. They're going to at least try to stop the late-term abortions, public funding of abortion, border security, a whole bunch of other things. I won't get to them all now, but you get a general idea. Appoint Supreme Court justices that'll go by the Constitution and not by progressivism, and surround himself with a lot of good Christian advisors. Well, progressives pretty much, they don't say this, but they pretty much don't really believe in a real God. So it's a good thing. It's a good day. It's a good thing. However, now I'm throwing a however in. You can say, well, you just said it was a good thing. Here's the however, when I throw a caution in here. We will probably have a little more peace and prosperity. They won't be picking on Christian bakers and all that. And we'll probably have more prosperity. But there's a danger in prosperity. You're going to say, what's the danger in prosperity? Let me explain it. But let me first show you why the investor world believes it's going to have prosperity. When they have first late Tuesday night when the Asian stock markets were open, and they realized, wait a minute, by midnight everybody knew Trump was going to win. There may be a outside chance Hillary could run the table, but it didn't look likely. Asian stock markets dropped 800 points. Everybody thought, oh, the futures market on Wall Street was down. There was going to be a massacre on Wall Street. Then as it got to Europe, it was only like 400 down, but they still expected a massacre because the progressive candidate had made secret deals with Wall Street. They wouldn't allow anybody to hear what she said in the private things, but it had to be something. They had bribed, so they had certain deals in for big government. But then when they finally got, as the sun rotated and the stock market opened, and it was only down like 100 points. Now, one major advisor said within 6 minutes, the U.S. stock market took a turn. Instead of going down, it turned and went up. They call it the surge in the market. It's at the highest, Wednesday and Thursday that it's been in many, many years. Now, you're going to say, how is that possible? At first, they say that investors don't like a surprise. They like things stable. That's true, and that's why it was down. But then they started thinking about it. The investors said, wait a minute. We have a candidate who's promising a pro-growth agenda. Cut business taxes, cut corporate taxes, and the taxes you pay on investment, and try to bring all that money that won't come back to America because of the high taxes back in, less regulation, going to press the Fed for easier capital for small businesses. They said, wait a minute, that's a pro-growth. We have a choice between a pro-growth candidate and a big government candidate. The pro-growth is more organic growth, not just manipulated growth. And they thought, whoa, that's good for us. And all of a sudden they realized, we're stupid to be playing stock down. And all of the stock shot up. And at the end of the week, it was, I think the Dow was up about 5.5, somewhere between 5.3 and 5.5. As I said, the highest it's been for many, many, many years. Maybe an all-time high. I'm not sure about that. It depends on how you break the numbers down. But it's really high. So that means it's a precursor to prosperity, probably. At least all the money people think it means less regulations to the financial market. They think it means prosperity. Let's assume they're right for a minute, that we're going to have prosperity and Christians will be hassled less in the future. And maybe America will be great again. Also, the people who are in aviation and, if we're going to build up the military, that means Lockheed, Grumman, and all those military, there's like some of those plants are even in St. Louis. They're going to get a lot of business. They were like, hey, that's good for us. A lot of those planes are made in America. And also, he promises the infrastructure, which for construction and concrete. All of them say, hey, this is good. Now, whether they can do all that and get it through Congress, we can hassle that later. But what you're going to say, well, if the money people see prosperity ahead of us, why is that a threat to Christians? And there's something the Bible says. The Bible says it's hard for a rich man to be saved. I think it's not impossible because obviously Abraham was relatively rich and he was saved. But I think the principle is this. If you have a lot of money, because I've met rich people and there's a certain air they have. And I mean, if I was rich, I guess I'd have it too. We'd all wish to be rich. But if you were rich, you don't need God. You got a fortune. You got hangers-on all around you, sycophants. You know what I mean. If you're rich, you're surrounded by sycophants and you got money in the bank, you got power. You probably don't even drive your own car. You have a limousine and people drive you. I mean, what do you need? I mean this figuratively. What do you need with God? Right? Well, that's obviously true for the rich. That's why it's hard. But to a lesser extent, we could get caught up in it too. The more prosperity, the less threat from the outside world. They're coming to get Christians and they're coming to get our guns. And the less of that threat, you'll start thinking you don't need God as much. And remember, whether we have prosperity or not, this is still the devil's world. Even if some of the bad things that we were seeing happen are not going to happen, as fast, and the downward trajectory of society is going to slow down. Even if all that is true, this is still the devil's world. And it's a toxic, as one man put it this way, it's a toxic world as far as deep spiritual growth. And if we relax, the danger is over, it's good times, Wall Street is busting, and there are jobs all over the place. My kids and grandkids have jobs, and there's money flowing, and and whatever you've got, your retirement benefits are in whatever they are, and now they're going to be higher than you thought they were going to be, and everybody, oh yeah, this is great, which is good. I'm not knocking good times and profit, but it could distract us from God. It really could. Going back to Deuteronomy 6:11. I'm going to just read this principle, Deuteronomy 6:11. And these are warnings that Moses gave as they were getting ready to enter the promised land. He said, houses full of all good things which you did not fill, hewn out wells which you did not dig. In other words, you're getting your house is full of good material goods. Vineyards and olives which you did not plant, when you have eaten and are full. In other words, we're eating, we got all the food we want and other stuff, and we're full. Then beware. Moses said, when you're full and you got all you want, you don't have anything to worry about, Moses says, beware. Beware, lest you forget the Eternal who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. In other words, in an atmosphere of peace and prosperity, Christians aren't hassled, and we don't have to worry about our kids as much. There's plenty of money floating around, and this happened to Israel on a regular basis. One way of looking at the book of Judges and some of the other books in the Old Testament, Israel would go through like 40-year cycles, and they'd have a good leader, and all the problems would get solved, and then they'd get into prosperity. The good leader would die, but they're in prosperity, and they just couldn't have prosperity without getting away from God. And then they'd have a crisis, and they'd be suffering, and then they cried out to the true God, and He'd rescue them. And they only cried out to God when they were suffering, when they were down. But if they were full and prosperous, they went worldly. They got away from God. That's the danger that could happen to us. And God would have to discipline them in one way or another. I guess each story is a little different. We have to avoid it. My advice is, if we do have prosperity and less pressure on Christians from the government, stay on your guard. This is still Satan's world. Stay on your guard. It's still Satan's world. No matter how easy things get, never ever forget you need God. In one sense, I'm saying in one sense, if I were the devil, there seems to be evidence that when Christians are really persecuted, they get closer to God and they get stronger. If I was the devil, I'd say, let them eat candy and relax a little longer. I want them to get so spiritually weak that when I put the hammer down, they won't have any spiritual oomph left. Another example of angry false prophets is in the New Testament, Matthew 23. Actually, the entire chapter of Matthew 23 is pretty much a condemnation of the false prophets in Christ's day. The scribes and the Pharisees were the major spiritual leaders of Israel or Judah of that day. And here's what Christ said about them, Matthew 23:13. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourself, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. In other words, your religious influence keeps people away from God. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You devour widows' houses. Not that they ate concrete, but they cheated them out of their estates because they were in charge of things. For you devour widows' houses. For a pretense you make long prayers. Out there praying long for everybody. And they said, Pharisee Joe is so pious. Generally, the guy acts real pious. Yeah, well, anyway. ought to be worried sometimes. Pretense make long prayers, therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte. When you want him, you make him twice as much, the son of hell as yourselves. So they were really, really bad. And he calls them in verse 33, serpents, brood of vipers. He's calling them snakes in the grass. Then he goes on to talk about all the bad things they do, and I want to just mention what they did for Judah. As false prophets, they obviously kept the Jewish people who did love Christ. Christ was so popular, mobs. He had to go up in the mountains sometimes to get away from mobs, or get in the boats to get away from mobs. There was a couple times where mobs of people, after he fed them, wanted to take him by force and march on Jerusalem and make him king. I mean, that's how popular Christ was. And the Pharisees were scared spitless of his popularity. But they eventually, took a while after he was resurrected, and God allowed it, they turned the people against the true Messiah and his church. And in their anger, there are a number of times when the disciples of Christ really embarrassed them. We just arrested the guy. He's supposed to be in the dungeon. Well, no, he's in the temple preaching to thousands of people right now. They got the whole city excited about their doctrine. They were really embarrassed by the success of Christianity. So they worked hard to get it. And here's what happened to Judah because of them. Now that they convinced the Jewish people to reject the Messiah, eventually, it took a while, but eventually they did. But they also said, hey, we can beat the Romans. And we'll have a great kingdom and it'll be more prosperous. Now, you realize how strong the Roman Empire was. People don't think of Roman legions because it's ancient times, but in a way they were like a mechanism of mass destruction. Read what they did to Carthage, their biggest rival. Anyway, they rebelled against the Roman Empire. And at first they had a little early success, and the Christians remembered what Christ said. When you see armies getting out, get out of there, and 20,000 Christians got out and were spared. And then Titus came back, and it's a gruesome story. They actually led to the destruction of the Jewish nation, and they hadn't been back to the Middle East since until 1948, thanks to the false prophets, the scribes and the Pharisees. If we listen to our media, which is our false prophets, they're going to lead to the degradation and fall of America. Many of the mistakes society has made now, I think they've made because the media has convinced them to do it. If NBC and CNN says something is the right way to go, I'd start questioning it. Just because if they say it, I doubt it. I'll put it that way. It may, they might. I'm sure they're right sometimes, but I wouldn't count on it. Let's look at, again, the Pharisees, Mark 3, the anger of the false prophets when they're embarrassed. Mark 3, verse 1. And he entered the synagogue again, and a man there with a withered hand. And remember, in those days, you didn't have all the tools we have now of prosthetics and special programs for the handicapped. If you had a withered hand, I mean, you really were at a disadvantage, much more than today. So they watched him closely, whether he should heal on the Sabbath. Now remember, it's almost like they're conceding, we know he can heal this guy anytime he wants. That in itself should have told them something. Now think about it. When is the last time they did anything like that? Probably never, right? So they knew he could do great miracles. They're in the synagogue watching him. Is he going to heal this? You would think that in itself would have told them something. I mean, I'm not sure how hard their heart was, how bad these false prophets were. And by the way, Christ could have healed them after the Sabbath, but he went out of his way to break their rules because he thought they were wrong. And what can I say? He criticized them openly, ran them out of the temples for their money-changing things, all of which, by the way, people ask, well, why didn't the temple police stop Christ when he was throwing out the money changers? He did it twice. Because they knew and the people knew Christ was right. Think about it. That embarrassed the Pharisees. When Christ said, you've turned my house, that should be a house of prayer, into a house of money cheaters. He was actually quoting a scripture in the Old Testament. They knew he was right. Everybody knew he was right. And it just embarrassed, the religious leaders that they allowed that. They were getting their cut of it, of course. That's why they didn't stop him. So you can imagine how they felt as they watched him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, step forward. And then he said to them, is it lawful? He's speaking to the Pharisees who were in the audience. He says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they kept silent. I mean, what are they going to say? They knew how good he was as a speaker and how much he knew Scripture. What are they going to say? No, you can't do anything good on the Sabbath because it's against our rules. They couldn't, they were embarrassed. What are they going to say? And when he looked around at them with anger, because he saw the hardness of their heart, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the other one. Now, the Pharisee says, oh, I guess we were wrong. When they were embarrassed by the truth, what did the false prophets do? Then the Pharisees went out immediately and plotted with the Herodians, these were evil politicians, against how they might destroy him, and some other places how they might murder him. Do you see a parallel between what's going on today and what I call the angry prophets of the day? When they don't get their way, they go, and we're going to see more of that. Expect it. The false prophets, when wrong and embarrassed, they say the right thing because they have to, but behind the scenes, they're angry. They want to strike back. They got their rent-a-mob already. Now let me tell you another corny story. This is called The Nun. A man was on a busy street corner in a big city on a business trip. He decided to go down to a bar to get a drink, and outside the bar was a nun with a tin cup. So being a good man, he threw a few coins in the cup. And what did the nun do? She launched off into a tirade against the evils of alcohol, how it's tearing apart society. Slightly annoyed, he said, listen, sister, I work hard for my money, and sometimes at the end of a hard business day, I like to have a drink or two. That doesn't make me a bad person. I'm a good family member. I have 2 wonderful kids. I take care of my family. I even give to some local charities. Yet you stand here and condemn me because I want to go in there and get a drink or two. The nun was slightly taken aback and replied, I see your point, my son. I apologize if I've offended you. But alcohol is such a powerful demon that all who consume it must be doomed in hell forever. Look, there you go again, said the man. How can you make such a sweeping statement? Have you ever even tried alcohol? Of course not, gasped the nun. The evil alcohol has never touched my lip. Do you really think that one glass of booze can change you from a devout nun to some kind of evil degenerate? Well, I really don't know. I'll tell you what, let's just go in the bar together and I'll buy you a drink and see what happens. She says, no, I will never be seen in such a place. I won't go in. He tries a second time. She says, no, it just wouldn't look good for me to go inside a bar. I could never go into such a place. So they can't sell it. She says, no, my son, I could never enter such a place. But how about this? You take my tin cup with you and you fill it with scotch and bring it out to me and I'll try it. You're on, said the guy. So she dumps the coins out, gives him the tin cup. He goes into the bar and he says, I want 2 scotch, 1 in a glass for me and 1 in this tin cup. And the bartender says, is that darn nun out there again? Well, I want to throw this out there. How can I use that? Well, the media is very tricky. A lot of their propaganda and brainwashing they put in the TV shows, and it's effective. I've seen several. You can tell they wrote the script to brainwash us on certain things, like vetting dangerous jihadists. You can't do that. That's unfair. But someday, I believe the false prophets, some leftist churches, and who just don't preach the Bible, they only preach what I call let's have fun and positive thinking, which is more about us than God. I'm not against positive thinking, but it's in church you should be getting the Bible, Bible, Bible instead. So I call the progressives in the media and some in leftist churches will eventually lead this nation to great disaster. I mean, that's what I'm predicting, like the Pharisees led the Jewish nation. I could be wrong. There are people saying on the radio, America's now going to have more time to turn back to God. And they said, you know, like the motto, make America great again, let's make America Christian again. Well, I mean, if that happens and America turns greatly back to God in the Bible and God saves America, that will be wonderful. But I really don't think it's going to happen. Because as I said, when they were going through the election results, they said, yes, there's a turn away from the radical progressivism, and that's a good thing. And they ignored the media, and that's a good thing. But underneath it, a lot of moral issues did not resonate like they should have. In other words, the country's still not that moral. I mean, it's good that we turned away from, you know, from abortion and the fast track towards some bad stuff, but it's still not a moral, we still haven't made that big turn in a moral direction. And it's probably not going to happen. And if I'm wrong, I'll be glad to be wrong. Because I'll be glad to be wrong. I think we've slowed down the decay or the decadence. And it would be great if God is giving us more time to do God's work and to turn everything around. And that may be true. At least we're getting more time to do God's work. But there's another bad side to that too. If I tell you we have more time before Christ comes, isn't that more likely to encourage you to relax and drift away from God and get more worldly, right? I think that's one reason God always left the apostles thinking Christ was coming back in their day, because it kept them up. And I believe Christ is coming back in our day. Maybe this election means we have a few more years before that happens, but maybe not. We don't really know. The future is unpredictable, right? The future is quite unpredictable. And I'm not going to read Jeremiah 23, 16, and 7, but basically what it says is the mainstream prophets of Jeremiah's day were leading the country in the wrong direction. And we need to realize that's probably going to happen to us. Let's go to John 10. It's probably going to happen in our day at some point. They almost led America astray this time, you know, almost, because, you know, it was still a close enough election. It wasn't a landslide. John 10, 11. And this is Christ talking about false prophets. John 10, 11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep, but the hireling, he who is not the shepherd, he does not own the sheep. He sees the wolf coming, leaves the sheep, and flees. And the wolf catches the sheep and scatters them. In other words, false prophets do it for the money. They do it for the money and maybe the fame and the attention. They don't really care about the public. Let me give you an opinion. I remember, you could say it about Ferguson too. It actually hurt the community of Ferguson. But the biggest one, if you watch the LA riots, and I knew the way the media was playing that one video and just what they were saying, they were going to create a tremendous, horrible riot. 50 people died in the LA riots, and parts of LA were burned and destroyed, which I've heard, at least people say this, some of those neighborhoods have not yet come back after all these years. So in other words, what the media did, both in Ferguson, LA riots, and others, it's really been bad for the public. It's been bad for people who live in the inner city. Does the media care? I think it hypes their ratings, and it pushes and justifies their agenda. They don't care if it's bad for the people in the inner city. That's my opinion. surely somebody by now going to realize, is this really good to play up certain things over and over again, show certain videos, just to hype those people who like to riot and stuff? It's not good for society. It's not good for the cities. It's not good for the people who live in the cities. As one lady said after Ferguson, well, I used to walk to the pharmacy and the grocery store. Now, I don't have a car. They're miles away. It's a lot harder for them. That's the result of what happens. And they can say what it'll come back. Maybe it'll come back. Maybe it won't. In Isaiah 56, 10, 11, what Isaiah says is the false prophets don't really know what they're talking about. They don't have any real good knowledge. I believe that's true. The people who are on the big stations like CNN and a lot of those smaller local ones, you think that they understand what I call consequences, because for every action there are natural consequences. No, they don't. They don't think about it. You think they understand economics when they're just spouting off the communist class warfare? No, they don't know anything about economics. They know anything about geopolitical? No, they don't. Most of them took a bunch of weird liberal classes in college on writing and, but colleges really don't teach a lot of stuff like they should. I remember I was in one of those journalism advanced classes, and they wanted us to do some stuff. And I did a little talk of what I learned about the balance of power theory. It shocked the professor and others, and they were all upset, like, we don't like to hear this kind of thing. But that's some basic geopolitics. If you don't understand that, you don't understand anything about geopolitics, but they don't. And they don't even like it to be said in their classes, like, oh. That's the reaction I got. In other words, they don't know what they're talking about, but they're on CNN. They still don't know what they're talking about. And they're misleading the public. So in closing, I still got a few more things to say, but in closing, I want to just say we probably will have some level of peace and prosperity in the future. And the devil is saying, relax, eat another piece of cake. Don't worry about staying close to God. But I'm going to read 1 Peter 1, 6, and 7 as my last scripture. And there are other scriptures that say similar things, but I'll just read this one. 1 Peter 1, 6, and 7. Peter says, in this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you've been grieved by various trials. For the genuineness of your faith being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire. In other words, what he is saying, and it's in other places, if you have tests and trials, rejoice because it pushes you closer to God. Though it may be tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So if trials push us closer to God, good times and prosperity leave us vulnerable to drift away from God. Do not let our guard down, because there may be some surprises coming that we don't see.